Yes, everyone, welcome back to Rock Again. In this video, I'll be talking to you about The Who. The Who looked like a band that had everything figured out. They stood on stages across the world with complete authority. They played louder than anyone else. They moved with a physical intensity that other bands could not match. From the outside, they appeared untouchable. But when you actually listen to what they were doing, something does not add up. The music never sounds settled. It never sounds like the work of people who feel secure in their position. There is always something pushing against itself, and that contradiction is worth thinking about. What made The Who so powerful in the first place was actually fairly simple. They were loud. Not just loud in the way that all rock bands are loud, but aggressively, almost unreasonably loud. They pushed their equipment past what it was designed to do. The guitars fed back. The drums hit harder than drums were supposed to be hit. The bass was not buried in the mix but right up front, almost competing with everything else. When you saw them live in 1966 or 1967, the volume was physical. It was not just something you heard, it was something you felt in your chest. But volume alone does not explain it. Plenty of bands turned their amplifiers up. What made The Who different was the precision inside the chaos. The rhythms were sharp and angular. The transitions were sudden. Songs did not drift from one section to another. They snapped. There was no softness to ease you through. You were either keeping up or you were left behind. And then there was the physical performance. Pete Townshend swinging his arm in wide circles, hitting the strings with his whole body. Keith Moon throwing himself at his drum kit like he was trying to break it. Roger Daltrey commanding the front of the stage with a presence that dared the audience to look away. John Entwistle standing almost motionless while his bass lines did the most complicated work of all. It looked like total confidence. It looked like control. But when you pay attention, you notice something else underneath. The strange thing about The Who is that success never seemed to calm them down. Most bands, when they reach a certain level, start to settle into what works. They find their sound. They repeat their formula. They get comfortable. The Who never did that. Every album felt like a fight. Every tour felt like something to survive. Even when they were selling out arenas and topping charts, the music kept pushing. It never relaxed. Part of this came from circumstances. The expectations placed on them grew faster than anyone could manage. By the late 1960s, they were not just a band. They were representatives of something larger. Youth culture, working class frustration, British identity in a moment of change. That kind of weight does not go away when you cash a royalty check. If anything, it gets heavier. And the schedule itself was relentless. In their peak years, The Who toured constantly. They recorded albums while exhausted. They promoted those albums while already thinking about the next one. There was no time to stop and appreciate what they had built. The machine kept moving, and they had to move with it. Restlessness was not a phase for them. It was not something they went through on their way to maturity. It was built into how they operated. The music demanded it. The personalities demanded it. Stillness would have meant something was wrong. To understand why The Who sounded the way they did, you have to understand the world they came out of. Britain in the mid to late 1960s was not a peaceful place to grow up. The Second World War had ended 20 years earlier, but its effects were still visible. Cities still showed bomb damage, resources were still limited, and class structures were still firmly in place. If you were born into a working-class family, your path was largely decided for you. You would work a job similar to your father's. You would live in a neighborhood similar to the one you grew up in. You would not expect much more. But something was changing in that generation. Young people were starting to reject the idea that their lives were already written. They wanted more. They wanted different. And they had no clear way to get it. That combination of desire and frustration created a very specific kind of energy. It was not optimistic. It was not hopeful. It was angry, but without a clear target. It was restless. The Who grew directly out of that environment. They came from West London. They played clubs where the audiences were mods. Young working-class kids who dressed sharp and looked for fights and wanted to feel like they mattered. The band did not observe this culture from a distance. They were part of it. They understood the frustration because they felt it themselves. When Pete Townshend wrote songs about confusion and alienation, he was not imagining what that felt like. He was describing it. When Roger Daltrey sang about being misunderstood and dismissed, he was drawing on real experience. The music was not commentary, it was testimony. Inside the band, things were never simple. Four people with very different personalities and very different ideas about what the band should be. Pete Townshend was restless intellectually. He wanted the music to mean something beyond entertainment. He pushed for concept albums, for rock operas, for statements. He was never satisfied with just playing well. He needed the work to carry weight. Roger Daltrey was more physical, more direct. He wanted the band to rock. He wanted to connect with audiences through energy, not ideas. He was protective of the band's direction and not shy about conflict when he disagreed. John Entwistle kept to himself. He let his playing speak for him, and his playing was extraordinary. But his emotional distance from the rest of the band created its own kind of tension. He was there, but he was also somewhere else. And then there was Keith Moon, unpredictable, brilliant, completely ungovernable. His drumming was like nothing anyone had heard before. Fills coming from unexpected places, rhythms shifting without warning, but his personality offstage was just as chaotic. He was the wild card that kept everyone else on edge. These four people did not fit together easily. They argued constantly. They threatened to quit constantly. They nearly broke up more times than anyone can count, but the friction produced something. It kept the band from ever settling into routine. Every decision was contested. Every direction was debated. Nothing was allowed to become automatic. You can hear this in the recordings, not the arguments themselves, but the energy that came from them. The music is never relaxed because the people making it were never relaxed with each other. Tension became the fuel. Certain songs show this more clearly than others. There is a track from 1965 where the singer cannot get his words out. He stutters. He struggles. He forces syllables through clenched teeth. And when the instruments finally explode behind him, it does not feel like triumph. It feels like relief, like pressure finally being released. There is another song that became an anthem for a generation. The words reject authority, reject age, reject anyone who claims to understand. But underneath the defiance, there is something else. A recognition that this stance cannot last. A quiet acknowledgement that rebellion has an expiration date. The song became famous for its anger, but its power comes from what is underneath the anger. Later, the band attempted something more ambitious. A full-length work about a boy who cannot see or hear or speak but somehow becomes a symbol for others. It was messy. It was overreaching. Parts of it do not work at all. But the ambition itself tells you something about where Townshend's head was. He was not interested in repeating success. He was interested in reaching further, even if that meant failing. None of these songs resolve cleanly. They do not offer comfort. They do not wrap up with lessons learned. They leave the tension intact, and that is part of why they still work. When you compare The Who to other major rock bands of that period, you notice different instincts. Some bands were chasing transcendence. They wanted to escape the world through sound, through drugs, through spiritual exploration. Others were building empires. They wanted control, wanted to expand their influence into new territories. Others turned inward, making music that was personal and introspective, almost private. The Who did none of those things. They were not trying to escape. They were not trying to build something permanent. They were not retreating into themselves. They were confronting. Every performance was a confrontation with the audience, with expectations, with themselves. This is not a judgment about which approach was better. Different bands needed different things, but it explains why The Who never arrived at a place of peace. Peace was not what they were looking for. What becomes clear, when you spend enough time with this music, is that the restlessness was not accidental. It was not a byproduct of difficult circumstances. It was not something they failed to overcome. It was the point. The Who could have smoothed out their sound. They were talented enough to make polished, comfortable records. They were successful enough to coast on what they had already built. But they did not. They kept pushing. They kept making things harder for themselves. They kept refusing the easy path. Some of this was conscious. Townshend talked openly about wanting to challenge the audience, wanting to make music that demanded something from the listener. But some of it was probably not conscious at all. It was just who they were. Four people who could not sit still. Four people who could not accept comfort. And that is why, even now, decades later, the music still sounds restless. It has not aged into something smooth and nostalgic. It still has edges. It still pushes. The Who were never the kind of band you put on for background music. They demand attention. They demand a reaction. Even their quieter moments feel like temporary pauses before the next collision. When you look at them in photographs from that era, they look invincible. They look like nothing could touch them. They look like they had conquered everything there was to conquer. But that is not what was happening underneath. Underneath, there was always movement, always friction, always the refusal to stay still. They looked untouchable, but they were never at rest, and they never wanted to be. Thank you for watching until the end. If The Who taught us anything, it is that restlessness can be a gift, not a curse. They never stopped pushing, and maybe that is exactly why we never stopped listening. Yes, today we talked about The Who in our own style. If you enjoyed our videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Bye for now.